Let's go. Today I'm talking about the 2006 movie 300. As always, this review is spoiler free. If you like what you see, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Zack Snyder's 300 follows King Leonidas and his army of 300 Spartans as they fight an impossible battle against the Persian Empire. Now, first things first, I know a lot of people get hot and bothered about the fact that this movie isn't very historically accurate. And I understand that if you're like a history buff and you really care about like the real historical events and stuff like that, I can understand being upset by that. But for me personally, history is always kind of boring to me. I don't really know the real history behind these events. And so to me, I'm not judging this movie based on how historically accurate it is. I am more judging this movie based on, is it telling a good story? Is it a good movie? And that's the standard that I'm going to be judging this movie by. Now, there are two main things that I want to compare and contrast about this movie. There is the story, which is honestly pretty mediocre and mostly takes a back seat. And then there are the visuals, which are the real appeal of this movie. This entire movie feels like one giant oil painting brought to life. Practically every single scene in the movie has some sort of color filter over it. Mostly the color that this movie favors is brown. There's always this heavy brown color filter over the entire palette of the movie. And that really gives the whole thing this kind of mythical, epic feel to it. But some scenes are also cast in these really deep blues or rich yellows. And I know that some people complain whenever there's a heavy color filter over a movie, but I personally don't mind it. I like movies like The Matrix where everything's cast in green, or, this movie where everything's cast in brown. I think it can really add a vibe and a mood to the movie, and I really like what it does to this movie. The landscapes here look less like realistic mountains and fields and cities, and more like illustrations that you might find in a book. They're not really realistic, but they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to evoke feelings, and they're supposed to speak to our imaginations. And to me, they really work on that level. The whole movie really feels like we're looking through Zack Snyder's mind's eye as he's imagining these historical events that took place long before the advent of video cameras. The battle scenes are where Zack Snyder's eye for style really comes into sharp focus. And yes, they do definitely abuse slow motion a little too much. I think like practically half of the battle scenes in this movie are taking place in slow motion, and it gets a little ridiculous after a while. But still, I'm not gonna lie, they are pretty awesome. There's really just something about the fight scenes in this movie that kind of speaks to that little kid inside of all of us that just wants to like pick up a stick and start, waving it around, pretending that we're chopping down armies of bad guys. And on that level, the battle scenes in this movie really work, and the details are just immaculate. Now, practically everything in this movie is stylized. Even basic conversations can't take place without this feeling of them being like larger than life. And sometimes the movie definitely does take things too far. For one thing, I don't think that the actors always have the level of skill that it takes to support the gravity of what the movie is trying to convey, because everything is so big and so larger than life. I don't necessarily blame them for not exactly selling every scene and making everything look perfect, because it would take a truly top tier actor to really sell some of these moments, because they're just so over the top. It's hard not to make some of the moments here look just a little bit silly. But the performances in general are mostly passable. They're not great. They don't really stand out. They're not a highlight of the movie, but overall, they're passable. They don't really make that big of an issue for me. But one stylistic choice I wanted to briefly mention that I found to be a bit distasteful is that the movie seems to have this weird obsession with these like grotesque body horror type of stuff. And look, as a fan of the horror genre, I don't necessarily have an issue with them doing this kind of stuff. It's more the way that some of these grotesque and monstrous characters are used in the movie just feels really weird and gross and kind of exploitative. and I don't like it. I don't like what he's doing here with some of these characters. But still, despite my issues with some of the stylistic elements, for the most part, the style of this movie is awesome. The visuals are great. This is one of the better looking movies that I've ever seen, and yeah, I dig the vibe. But for me, the question is, does the story at the heart of all this beautiful cinematography really hold up? And the answer is not really. I feel mostly pretty cold towards the story here. The dialogue is really clunky. All the characters basically just speak in cliches, and everything that they say is super predictable. There's nothing that really plays against what you'd expect these characters in a movie like this to say. And so, because of that, I never really connect with the characters on a human level. I more just see them as like these cold historical figures that I'm looking at, and maybe, these are historical figures to be admired, but they're not really characters to be known in this movie, and the movie doesn't really humanize them, in my opinion. The message that they're conveying here is mostly a positive one. I think it is good to look back and remember these events of the past and these men who stood up and did these courageous things, but I just don't think the message is put forward in all that interesting or creative of a way. And so it doesn't really hit home as well as it could, and I don't really find it to be all that like inspiring, or it doesn't really get me going in the same way that a movie like, for instance, Braveheart would do a lot better than this. So yeah, this movie might be honestly the ultimate example of style over substance. The story doesn't really feel like it matters all that much. It more just feels like it's a vehicle in order for Zack Snyder to do all these awesome visuals and these cool battle scenes, but it's not like the story at the core of it, or the characters that are characterizing the story, or even really the message and the themes of the movie are really all that big of a deal. I think it's more just about seeing this, oil painting brought to life. And so on that level, the movie is pretty awesome, but if you're actually looking for a good movie, a good story, there are so many movies that you could do way better than this one to see. So, in my opinion, I'd say it's a strong 5 out of 10.